I'm Darnice Martin, and I have been teaching at Loyola Marymount University for about 20 years. I do religion. I am located in the African American Studies Department, remotely these days. But wherever they put me, whatever I do, wherever I go, whatever they ask me to teach, I have to say, asterisk, I do religion. So that's how that's going to be. Yeah, so my field is cultural and historical studies, and I focus on Africana, African American religions, and the esoteric metaphysical traditions like New Thought, folk magical practices. That's what I normally do. I don't usually share my experience or stories, but here we are, here we go, and I've had, it somehow doesn't come up. It doesn't come up, but I continue to have different experiences, so I'll be sharing with you one of them. So, guess I'll just jump in. From my personal visionary extraterrestrial dream-like experience, I'm exploring images, symbols, and narratives that address alternative narratives, spaces, and meanings which center Black bodies in otherworldly systems. I ponder the reality that there is place, space, dimension where Black bodies are not always in resistance to or hypervigilant against myriad threats of systemic racism. To the contrary, Blackness is at rest and ontologically whole. This exploration will be punctuated with select artists and their cultural productions because they provide lyrical and symbolic alternative realities full of texture, culture, and spiritual commentary. That's what they said to me. I will be sharing in this extended outline a personal visionary experience which I situate at the intersection of Africana religious cultures and art, popular culture, and cultural production. This interdisciplinary phenomenological treatment takes an Afrofuturist perspective in that it reimagines and recreates alternative realities where Black bodies represent safety, familiarity, recognition, support, and meaningful off-planet existence, free from narrative systems and structures that function to limit and curtail Blackness. Additionally, I look to artists including Janelle Monáe, Andre 3000, and Earth, Wind, and Fire as I tease out my own Black esoteric religious experience in which I am experiencing the dream visionary world and wrestling like Jacob with the meanings present and future conveyed by the vision. So the following is my visionary experience. Okay, so I'm just going to read it out. Okay. I was standing in a house in the kitchen, standing at the sink, looking out of the window into my backyard. I can remember it was a large kitchen with a white tile floor, a deep sink, and lots of counter space. I don't know this house, yard, or kitchen in my actual life. I was receiving a message telepathically. We're on our way. Almost immediately and simultaneously, the light beings were calling me on the phone and landing in my backyard. I was still using the phone, but really communicating telepathically, and I said, "How are you using the telephone?" Like, what are we even doing? Like, what are you doing? I thought you were on your way, but you're here right now. You know, like if a friend says, "I'm on my way, I'll be there in 10 minutes," and you think, okay, I have time to get up and put on something else or whatever. But they're knocking. "I'll be there in 10, and they're knocking. "Yes, we're here. We'll come out now." I think there were 4 or 5 of them who stepped out of a small round ship. They were all glowing pale golden light. There was a general human shape, but no physical features. They were all light. I was still in my kitchen and wondering if my neighbors were seeing this. I was a little nervous. I was expecting them, but not prepared at the same time. Suddenly, they were walking into my back door. But, are you ready? As they stepped across the threshold into the kitchen, they became Black women. They shape-shifted into elder Black women who seemed to me to be grandmotherly and comforting. Like literally coming across the, like it was like I could see, okay, there's like a ship and there's light beings and they don't move, they don't walk, they don't, right, they just here, there, right, so, let's see, where was I? I don't remember any conversation or telepathy then. I just stood there staring. I seemed to be expecting something to happen. My next memory is of them telling me they had to leave telepathically. I did not want them to leave. I wanted to have a conversation. I felt like I had a lot of questions that I had not gotten answered. I was kind of chasing behind them as they walked back across my yard toward their ship. Once at the ship, they became light beings again, even brighter. One of them communicated to me, he seemed male, "You won't remember most of this." Why not? No response. The door of the ship lifted and they were gone. I remained in my yard for a while. I knew that something had happened in this encounter, but I could feel the memory fading as I tried desperately to hold on to it. And so I use this idea of Jacob wrestling with the angel because that's what I felt like. Wait. I'm trying to get something here. This is a meaningful thing right here, and you have to tell me why you're here. And you have to tell me how you got here. You have to tell me all these things. And they were like, no. So like, but I do have the idea that like something like there was a, what do we call this? Like a probing? There was something that happened, right? Like I knew that. It's like I was expecting it before it happened. And I knew it even as they were leaving, but I couldn't quite remember. And that's what I was trying to grasp onto, like literally like, wait, and what do you mean I'm not gonna remember most of it? Because I'm remembering it right now, I'm gonna remember. And it was just like slipping. And so it's like that wrestling. And Jacob, if you don't know this, you can look up Genesis 32 when you get a chance, BibleGateway.com. I tell my students if you don't have, right? And so verse 28 here, your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome. And so it's not exactly that, but it was like, you're not going to be the same. And you're struggling for something, but you can relax and you're just not going to be the same. Now, another experience that I had was, I'm going to say similar, no, in the sense that I feel like I had an experience where there was I don't have another word for probe. If you do, let me know. But through the ear, and I had several of these experiences before, and I would wake up this is a period of time, years, and I would have a pain in my ear into my throat. You know how you get an ear infection and you get in your throat? So I would have this, and I would tell my best friend all the time, you know what, I don't know what's happening, and she'd go, oh, you got probed again. So it's not like I tell many people about this at all, but I tell her, and so that's, now. So as I write here, the vision is not the first encounter. I've had other incidents that seem more dreamlike than this visionary experience in which I am participating. So this one really felt like a visionary, I'm involved kind of experience. The other one seemed more dreamlike, but still extremely vivid, like a lucid dream. So I've not shared these experiences with many people. My best friend who hears it all says I must have been probed, which he says because sometimes I wake up with lingering ear pain after these experiences. So I don't know, but that's how it goes. It can happen. What does happen is that I have encounters with non-physical light beings, maybe extraterrestrials, and precognition phenomena that I cannot describe. That's pretty common. This vision was unique because it did not seem like a dream or of a memory, and it featured the embodiment of spiritual beings as Black women, which was significant for me. Despite narratives, systems, and structures that seek to devalue and dehumanize Black bodies, spirit beings take on Black bodies. The word became Black flesh in my experience. The major themes that I'm working with in this vision dream are Black female embodiment, a fluidity of beingness and embodiment where form, time, and space were not fixed, yet still important as I interacted with and tried to make sense of shape-shifting beings and elusive circumstances characteristic of a quantum world. What does the presence of Black grandmotherly figures represent in a quantum world? What was the meaning of these embodiments to me? Safety, familiarity, recognition, support. Is this embodiment reflecting a personal or an archetypal understanding of primordial humanity? As Afrofuturists affirm, there is a place for Blackness in the future, free from limits of the white imagination. Blackness is not overlooked. It is not a colorblind spirituality, nor one that requires us to disregard Black embodiment. I posit that these other quantum realities allow Blackness to celebrate being young and gifted, to declare itself beautiful, proud, and to proclaim that Black life matters. I engage with select artists. Thank you. I engage with select artists and their cultural productions because they provide lyrical and symbolic alternative realities full of texture, culture, and spirituality. Cornel West states that the power of the poet is to foretell a vision of freedom for the unfree. I'm going to repeat that because of the times we live in. The power of the poet is to foretell a vision of freedom for the unfree. Artists such as Janelle Monáe, Earth, Wind, and Fire, and Andre 3000, and Parliament Funkadelic position Blackness as central, otherworldly, technological, and esoterically informed. The following artists provide a resonant soundtrack for me as I continue to delve deeper into the meaning of my visionary experience. These works complement my thinking as I actively engage the imagery of Black women, starships, UFO, UAP, and the illusory nature of time and form. Janelle Monáe, pictured here, sings about Black womanhood in her song Django Jane from the album Dirty Computer. And here are some of the other lyrics. We gave you life, we gave you birth, we gave you God, we gave you earth. Andre 3000's album New Blue Sun is a work of esoteric healing frequencies we didn't know we needed. Are y'all familiar? If not, Google is your friend, as I always say. YouTube has everything. My uncle, who's 82, has just discovered that YouTube has everything. And he's like, does it have Whitney Houston? Does it have, what was that song? And he tries to think of it. Does it have, yes. Does it have The Temptations? Okay, so. It does, right? So in this flute album, you may know Andre 3000 was half of the duo Outkast, so hip-hop. And so you may remember him from that, and he was silent musically for a long time in terms of the public, and so he returned with this much-anticipated album, and people were quite upset because it was a new age, woo-woo flute album. How dare he? So in this flute album, Andre reflects upon metaphysical questions of ultimate meaning and shifting realities as he invites listeners into a sonic and vibrational journey, punctuated by his ayahuasca experiences and That Night in Hawaii, I Turned Into a Panther, and his perspective inverting song, Ants to You, Gods to Who? Oh, I went too far. Okay. Earth, Wind, and Fire have often included an array of esoteric and religious symbols on their album covers over the years. The cover art on most of their albums, including All in All and multiple greatest hits compilations, depict Kemetic pyramids, the Eye of Heru, aka Horus, a UFO, an Ankh, a Star of David, and a Christian cross. The Earth, Wind, and Fire discography is too vast to fully discuss here, but I offer the song Devotion as representative of the intersecting themes of love and spirituality that permeate their catalog. And so I just put together some of their album covers here. I found this, which I thought was perfect. And so Earth, Wind, and Fire has been speaking to us esoterically in image and music for, all of their career, really. But it's kind of like that, do you have eyes to see, do you have ears to hear? Because while some may dismiss a lot of things that we're talking about here, or the existence of, what should we call them, extraterrestrials? Earth, Wind, and Fire have been integrating that into their music in such a way that it is somewhat of a given. And from a Black hermeneutic perspective, there is a place, there is a space that we imagine that is way different than this place. Way different, and we're actually free. So I don't know if you get that. There's a difference between being emancipated and being free. Right? Free is, I don't have to worry about how many people who look like me are gathered in the grocery store parking lot. But if you think in your mind right now, you have a number. The grocery store that you go to, maybe the upscale grocery store in your neighborhood or your city where you live, there's a certain amount of the other who can show up before, right? So, Cornel West, Earth, Wind, and Fire, Janelle Monáe, we imagine, the Black imagination says there's a space where these questions are not part of identity because we're actually free. And so I'm free to speak what I need to speak. I'm free to perform in the way that I want to perform. And this extraterrestrial type of life is that. It is not actually literally color-bound, but as humans, we are enfleshed in a certain kind of body. We're enfleshed. And so that must mean something. And I think, okay, they showed up to me in a way, in a particular way. So it must mean something. It's my interpretive lens. I'm like, okay, the grandmothers were like warm, nurturing, right? And so, okay, we might stick something in your ear right now, but it won't hurt but a little bit, baby. And then you won't remember and it'll be okay, and go have some cake. I don't know, or something. So I'm just aware that, my particular hermeneutic or a Black religious hermeneutic allows me to see in ways that others don't. And, some of that is archetypal for me, for us. What else was I going to say? There was something from Janelle Monáe. Oh, yeah. Y'all can't ban it. Made out like a bandit. They've been trying hard just to make us all vanish. I suggest they put a flag on a whole nother planet. Right. And I'm gonna, how much time do I have?
Just go.
Okay. I was going to add something too. Well, I don't think I'm going to. I don't have time to do all of that, but I was just going to mention the work of Stephen Finley. I know a lot of you know him. He does work with he and I collaborate quite a bit on working with the Nation of Islam and the ways in which this Black nationalist religion actually re-envisions extraterrestrial spaces, again, where Black people are free. But it is a Black nationalist religion, and so they come at it from a Black nationalist perspective, which inverts, right? Like, okay, we are the originators of humanity, and therefore the world looks this way. And so Janelle Monáe is kind of saying, she's getting at, because I know the whole song, right? That she's getting at on a whole nother planet, Western civilization is meaningless. Meaning the terminology, the worldview, the framing of things is meaningless. Elijah Muhammad and Louis Farrakhan from the Nation of Islam say that in a particular kind of a way, but Janelle Monáe here is saying it in a way too that says the framework that you're working with is inadequate. And as I listen to the scientists who I'm learning from, I definitely am learning from. But to me, and this might be a dumb question, maybe, I don't know. I'll ask a scientist. When you consider, okay, distance, like, oh, they would have to travel this long to get here, this is why this is not possible, da, da, da. But they don't have the same math. They don't have the same, they don't travel like that. They don't do this. They set a coordinate and they show up. Like Star Trek, number one, set a coordinate, and we're going, right? So I'm just thinking, like, as a scientist, is for real? I'm thinking I don't get it. And one of you will explain it to me. Because to me, it seems rather clear, like, they don't travel the same way. They don't put one foot in front of the other. They don't get in a car and, oh, it's going to take me 2 hours to do this 100 miles. They don't do that. So that, again, our way of understanding or trying to understand is rather limited by human knowledge and largely on this planet, Western civilization. So to some degree, we need a whole nother planet. We need a whole nother planet because we have to think way differently. Anyway, these are the people who are helping me to do that. The grandmothers show up, they're helping me to do that. That is that anomalous moment where you have something happen to you and it pokes at you in such a way that you really can't go back to whatever you were doing like it was nothing, right? Oh, I'm just gonna go to yoga now. Right, you gotta work with that on some level, and it's not instant. It's something that is expanding us. It's something that is, it's something that is expanding us. It's something that is perhaps elevating us to be a better species. So I'll end with that.
Am I okay on the mic? Good. All right. Okay, my name is Jim Madden, and and not only do I have to follow a tough act, but I have made a mess up here already. Okay, so I do pay many of my bills teaching philosophy, but I hope you will not hold that against me. Okay. The title of my presentation is "The UFO Doesn't Exist, but It Insists." All right. And I begin with a remark from one of the 20th century's greatest poet philosophers, Peter Townsend of The Who told us, "Meet the new boss, same as the old boss." All right. The phrase ontological shock is common parlance in ufology. Though I am no historian of this literature, I suspect that talk of ontological shock first entered the field through John Mack's various accounts in his work with patients reporting UFO experiences. For example, Mack tells us the following. Abductees also experience what I have called ontological shock, as the reality of their encounters sinks in. They, like all of us, have been raised in the belief that we on Earth are largely alone in the universe, and it would simply not be possible for intelligent beings to enter our world without using a highly advanced form of technology and obeying the laws of our physics. Abductees tend to persist in the hope that a psychological explanation for their experiences will be found, end quote. The idea here is that the metaphysical implications of the experiences recalled by Mack's patients are so gravely disturbing that in many cases these experiencers would prefer a psychological debunking of those memories rather than face the conclusion that they are likely veridical. It would, so Mack seems to tell us, be easier for many of them to accept the possibility that these experiences are just in their heads than it would be to suffer the wholesale revision of their default scheme of reality entailed by bona fide encounters with extraterrestrial visitors, especially those who are bent on catch and release operations with human subjects. Indeed, it is not hard to believe that there are revelations so destabilizing to one's web of belief that she might prefer to question her own sanity than to face up to an utterly uncanny new world, one in which she could hardly find her way around anymore. As H.P. Lovecraft puts it, "Vision or nightmare it may have been, vision or nightmare I fervently hope it was," end quote. Of course, not all experiencers claim to meet up with literal extraterrestrials, and there are many theories abroad in the literature as to what the others might be. For example, ultra-terrestrials, extratempestrials, extra-dimensionals, angels, demons, fairies, our past dead, etc., etc. No one, however, would say that any of these encounters or other ways of framing UFO encounters or abductions are any more existentially comforting than the standard extraterrestrial scenario. All that being said, I have to admit that what most staggers me about many of these accounts is that what most staggers me about many of these supposed cases of ontological shock is precisely how unalarming they are metaphysically and ontologically. That is not to say that an encounter with a mantid being or an internal examination by gray aliens utterly devoid of outward signs of empathy would not be traumatizing. I doubt neither the unpleasantness of such episodes nor the earnestness with which many of them are reported, and I also believe that many of these reports point to actual events. Moreover, such encounters are usually entirely unexpected given one's prior experiences, and they thereby may lead their subjects to question a great deal of what they previously trusted about the world. Consider what it would be like to encounter a previously unknown exotic species of predatory reptile, or being kidnapped by a clandestine criminal cabal for the purposes of harvesting one's organs. Both events would likely produce starkly novel experiences that carry life-altering consequences. Would we say, however, that an encounter with a three-headed monitored lizard in the basement or a debasing kidnapping incident were ontologically shocking? No doubt these events would change things, and they would give us new information, even information that would leave us wary in previously comfortable situations. But I doubt either would force a revision of our ontology. Realizing that there are three-headed monitors or organ harvesting criminal gangs on the loose would change what I imagine to be the concrete possibilities of what might await around the next corner. But such threats would not alter the implicit structure of my understanding of the world. These possibilities are novel, but they are still squarely within our going imaginary register. The categories of reptile and criminal cabal would be expanded, but that is not to put the entire system of ontological categorization under suspicion. As some philosophers would put it, these experiences might force an ontical, but not an ontological change in one's bearing toward the world. Likewise, we should analyze the ontological gravity of experiencer reports in a similar manner. Encounters with mantid beings and alien abductions force us to imagine different concrete possibilities, though they do not change things at the most fundamental level of ontology. Whether we are ruled by an elite class of billionaires or the reptilian overlords of conspiratorial lore doesn't matter structurally. These are the same accounts of things implicitly, even though they imagine the underlying ontology differently. No doubt, there is an ontical difference between the two accounts, but it isn't ontological. They both interpret the world in terms of predation and deception. They both posit dastardly agencies running everything from behind the curtain. These two different imaginings are alike in what they take as the meaning of being. There's a real difference between my organs being harvested by drug cartels and biopsies by gray aliens, no doubt. But these two stories have the same implicit ontological structure. If it turned out that what had been long imagined to be the nefarious work of criminal gangs exploiting a black market for biological goods is really the doing of gray aliens managing their human livestock, that would be a significant datum. But it is not a rethinking of the world at its most basic level of meaning and significance. The world would still be the same kind of place, an arena of exploitation and violation, even though we would have to imagine it as being populated with new entities, while also entertaining new possibilities for what the future may hold. Such a revelation, though practically important, is a movement within our going ontology, but not a wholesale revision of what we might have thought it means to be at all. Gray aliens and mantid beings, abductions and otherworldly craft, etc., are well within our standard ontological framings, even if they force us to imagine new ontical possibilities. Again, none of this is to question the legitimacy or significance of people's experiences, but only to call into question the use of the term ontological shock to describe their consequences. Mack introduced the phrase ontological shock into the discourse about UFOs and abductions, but it had a life before that. As far as I know, ontological shock was coined in a Heideggerian vein by Paul Tillich in his magisterial work, Systematic Theology. For Tillich, ontological shock is an existential mood that discloses the, quote, threat of non-being, end quote. The sense of the utter groundlessness of our manner of being in the world, as expressed in the perennial questions, as Tillich puts them, why is there something? Why not nothing? For the subject of ontological shock, the former question becomes gravely important because the latter question seems unanswerable. For all humanly articulable intents and purposes, there should be nothing. In other words, there is nothing that recommends our ontological scheme as privileged. Our ontology has been revealed as merely the scheme we just so happen to occupy by historical happenstance. And even more distressing, this is true of all human attempts at grasping the being of things. Whatever something might be for us, it just as well might have been nothing. Ontological shock comes as, quote, the anxiety in which individuals are aware of their finitude, end quote. That is, one is put in a mood that reveals her utter contingency and the contingency of the world of meaning she previously occupied and maneuvered within effectively. Being will get along just fine without us individually and collectively, and it is no less indifferent to our attempts to understand it. This mood is not anxiousness about the failure of this or that imaginary attempt to get a grip on the real, but the dreadful angst that comes with the revelation that we are, as finite and embodied beings, always dealing with a convenient caricature of being. Ontological shock is not a change in the officially recognized entities of our going scheme of categories, but the abysmal realization that humankind is not ontologically privileged, nor especially competent in this manner. In this sort of hermeneutical phenomenology, an ontology is not something we hold consciously in our everyday getting around. An ontology is an implicit interpretation of being that provides the necessary conditions for our ordinary ways of imagining things, the background that allows something to be in the foreground. And it can only be revealed by a sort of interpretive excavation. Moreover, our implicit understanding of things is mostly revealed by an encounter with its failure. It is noticed primarily in its absence. We get a sense of our principles of making sense of things by encountering no thing. Thus, part of the anxiety of ontological shock is a bitter irony. I only understand what my world of meaning was about once I come to its point of failure. Prior to stumbling upon our finitude, in our everyday way of getting around a familiar world, our ontology is unconscious. We catch our understanding as it slips away. We're always a little too late on the scene to take our stance entirely seriously. Tillich is a theologian of a sort, and for him, ontological shock need not be the end of the story. Our existential anxiety might open us up to something else, which is beyond all our possible ontological scheming. Be that as it may, ontologies die hard, no less than our ideologies. Tad DeLay makes this point with respect to the latter when he says, quote, the unconscious insists on repetition. The big other is non-existent, but insists with a clamoring and voracious appetite, end quote. The big other is a term of art for the shared symbolic pact that we all unconsciously participate in by virtue of a common linguistic acquisition or maybe even an imposition. The big other is the implicit subject for whom we all perform whenever we say, fine, thank you, in reply to the equally routine, how are you, every morning around the office. One can admit that the big other does not exist. These formal pleasantries are a really silly game. And yet, I'm sure when asked, how are you, the requisite response will be made. We are all told at one point that if you want the little others in our vicinity to help you get what you desire, or even to help us know what we ought to desire, then there are certain rules of the game that must be obeyed. We, like everybody else, must act as this big other requires, otherwise we'll be left out in the cold. Notice that the big other doesn't govern us consciously. I don't make a conscious decision about the required reply of fine, thank you, and nobody ever sat me down to explain the rules of this game. Thus, it's not up to my conscious sense, my imaginary register, as to whether I will play by the big other's rules. That has been set for me well before I arrived. Even if I realize the big other doesn't exist, that I accept that we pretend it into being, it still insists on its demands. The game of etiquette around the water cooler is easy to poke fun at, but theorists of this sort, like Slavoj Žižek, argue that this is the model for how ideology works. Quote, ideology is not simply an illusory representation of reality. Rather, ideology is a social reality whose very existence implies non-knowledge of its participants as its essence, end quote. The point here is that the fundamental ideological content of our thoughts and utterances is not necessarily within our conscious purview. Ideology works precisely because we do not consciously know all that we are really up to in what we say and what we do. We might overtly deny X and instead now claim to believe Y. And yet, when seen from a structural perspective, this supposed change in semantic commitment is really a reimagining of the stable symbolic contents operating in our unconscious psychical background. I can make all sorts of claims about my newly gained commitments contrary to the dominant ideology, but when observed in the proper way, I will mostly be revealed as simply inserting new imaginary descriptions into the same old structural system. To reverse the New Testament analogy, we are usually just putting old wine into new wineskins. I am suggesting that fundamental ontology operates much like the ideological big other. We do not encounter our most important ontological understandings from within our conscious imaginary register, and therefore changes at the latter level can mask stasis at the former level. What is now often called ontological shock may well be a way of clinging to an underlying ontological structure by allowing for a change in the imaginary register that leaves our fundamental interpretation of being unmoved. That is not to say an experiencer hasn't had a run-in with something truly abysmal, an encounter with a reality that shakes her sense of being able to make sense of reality at all. Rather, my point is to suggest that we be vigilant as we consider any identifications made regarding the entities appearing in such experiences. In particular, we should be wary of a human tendency to reimagine the same structural position in an implicit ontology as a way of conserving that scheme of things. Are we avoiding the consequences of the ontological abyss by recasting an uncategorizable encounter within the flexible categories of the imagination, so as to preserve our self-confidence as arbiters of what there is? This is not to mistrust the experiencer, but to recognize the all-too-human tendency to conserve our cognitive lifelines. Our obeisance to the big other is all we have to go on, so we will only give it up dearly. Renouncing the basic rules to the only game we know how to play is not something our psyche is apt to do willingly. Maybe all there is in the phenomenon is something akin to the discovery of a new species of reptile or a previously unknown criminal enterprise, which of course would be no small discovery. But we will never know whether there is something truly abysmal, a bona fide ontological shock to our symbolic system, unless we are attuned to how our own imaginal plasticity might be working to protect us from confronting that very sort of admission. Our dearly cherished principles of sense-making could constitute the most intractable obstacles standing between us and what might be an intrinsically nonsensical reality. Or maybe UFOs are really angels and demons. I'm not one to insist. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming and for lending us your attention for a little while. My name is Matt Bowman. I am a professor of religion and history at Claremont Graduate University in Claremont, California. You may have noticed on the program that my official title is Howard W. Hunter Chair of Mormon Studies. I was hired at my university to teach about Mormonism and other new religious movements. In between that, I have written articles about Bigfoot and recently a book on Betty and Barney Hill. What I want to share today is a new project that I am working on UFO belief in the Mormon tradition. And particularly, I want to start in Prescott, Arizona, which is about 60 miles south of Sedona, about 180 miles from the Three Mesas, which is the heart of the Hopi Nation. And in 1969, a man named Paul Solem moved to Prescott. Newspapers there called him a UFO prophet. He regularly gathered groups of curious people, and he promised them that he could show them what he called flying saucers. And sometimes he did. Joe Kraus, the managing editor of the local newspaper, the Prescott Courier, had an encounter one night with Solem the evening of Friday, August the 7th, 1970. Kraus and some of his friends went into a backyard with Solem, and he moved apart, Solem did, from the crowd, stood by himself and began meditating. He later told Joe Kraus that, quote, he was calling mentally. And then Solem began yelling, "They are here, they are here." He pointed at the sky, and after a couple of minutes, a star appeared in the sky that was not there before, Kraus wrote. Solem then began reciting messages that he said, quote, the people in the saucer were communicating to him. And Kraus watched as a light that he said looked like a star, rose in the sky, stopped, hovered, and wavered. It lasted for nearly half an hour. And Solem dictated aloud the entire time. When he stopped talking, the light vanished. The Courier reported on at least two other occasions in which Solem appeared to have successfully summoned a light in the sky that he called a saucer. It also reported a number of occasions in which Solem failed to do this. By the following April, locals were calling Solem a sham, and soon he left town. Now, I grew interested in Paul Solem because he was a disaffected member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Because of that, I'm going to call him a Mormon, but I want to distinguish between those two words. By Mormon, I mean something broader than affiliation with this particular religious community, this particular institution. By it, I mean a whole collection of ideas and practices that share a genealogy with that institution, but which the institution may or may not actually embrace. This genealogy of ideas and practices shaped Solem's belief about these things that he called flying saucers. And that indeterminacy is also what I want to explore a little bit here, drawing on the work of two particular theorists. The first being Thomas Guerin, who's a philosopher of science, who has described what he calls boundary work, the process by which members of a community, be that a scientific community or a religious community or a political community, the process by which that community defines who is in and who is out. Scientists do this through institutions, PhD programs, peer review. Religious organizations do it as well through doctrine and orthodoxy and excommunication. The point here, though, is that words like science and religion are not natural realities. Nothing is inherently scientific or inherently religious. Rather, those terms are labels that we use to sort out knowledge and to put knowledge in different buckets. When we don't want something to be a religion, we will call it a cult, right? When we don't want something to be scientific, we will call it pseudoscience, and vice versa. That process is at work in the life of Paul Solem. Another process is as well, and that is a process I'm going to call spiritual disciplines. or practices. And I draw here on the work of the anthropologist Tanya Luhrmann, who has described at work in multiple communities, from neo-pagans on the one hand to evangelical Christians on the other, a set of spiritual practices and disciplines that facilitate members of these communities in perceiving reality in new ways. As people embrace spiritual disciplines, they begin to perceive presences, others, as she calls them, in their lives, who affect and influence them in ways that they might not have perceived earlier. Both of these theorists guide how I interpret Paul Solem, who is, of course, heir to a tradition with a long history of struggling over boundaries of legitimacy and knowledge, Mormonism. I want to back up now and talk a bit about his intellectual genealogy in Mormonism. This is Matthew Dalton. Matthew Dalton lived in Brigham City, which is a small town 60 miles north of Salt Lake City, which is the headquarters of the LDS Church. In 1907, Dalton published a book that he called The Period of God's Work on This Planet. This book is about the lost 10 tribes of Israel, whom, if you know your Hebrew Bible, you know vanish mysteriously after being captured by the Assyrians in the 700s BCE. There is a long tradition in Christianity and Judaism of speculating on the fate of these people. Matthew Dalton believed that God had taken them to another planet, intending them to return to Earth to inaugurate the second coming of Jesus Christ. And you see these diagrams that Dalton drew describing these other planets. Dalton said he had 3 sources for this idea. First, he said that Joseph Smith, the founder of the Mormon tradition, believed it, and I suspect he's actually right about that. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence to suggest this. Second, Matthew Dalton had prophetic dreams about Native Americans. Like many 19th and 20th century Mormons, Dalton believed that the Book of Mormon taught that Native Americans are in fact descended from the house of Israel. And Dalton's dreams confirmed this and also connected Native Americans to the second coming of Jesus Christ. Dalton believed that these dreams were, quote, sent by the Lord to guide me in my efforts as he sought to understand better the fate of the lost 10 tribes. Finally, Dalton was also a participant in what the scholar Craig Hazen calls the Village Enlightenment, which is a 19th century tradition of Americans who assumed that their religious beliefs and the knowledge generated in the emerging tradition called science would be the same. Mormonism was born in the Village Enlightenment. It was and remains defiantly materialist. Joseph Smith asserted, for instance, that the human soul is in fact material. It can be measured. It is what he called refined matter. Joseph Smith believed that God was a man with an exalted physical body who dwells somewhere in the universe, and that his divine knowledge and power come from his advanced comprehension of material reality. Dalton, therefore, believed that this planet where the lost 10 tribes were could be found by empirical observation. And he thought that he could prove this through invoking dreams and science. He invoked a number of ideas popular among 19th century scientists to defend this argument, but I want to invoke simply one here. This is the notion of catastrophism. This is an early modern theory of geology, which maintained that the Earth itself is largely static. Nothing ever changes on the Earth except at brief, sudden intervals of sudden, massive convulsions. Dalton believed that Noah's flood was one such catastrophe, and he believed that geology could prove that the planet where the lost 10 tribes live was created by Noah's flood. All of us who have written a book know what it is like to send your little baby out into the world. Matthew Dalton did this, and he was terribly dismayed when the leaders of his church dismissed his book. He understood that they were dismissing not only his arguments, but his epistemology. John Whitsoe was an apostle of the church, one of its highest leaders, and he called Dalton's book, quote, unacceptable and fantastic. Concerning the hypotheses that the lost tribes reside on a secondary planet, we can only say that such conjectures are wholly unsupported by discoveries and by revelation. Note here that Whitsoe is dismissing both Dalton's claims to be scientific and the evidence of Dalton's dreams. It is of paramount importance here that Whitsoe was a member of the scientific establishment. He held a PhD in chemistry, and he wrote his own book, which he called Joseph Smith a Scientist, arguing that, quote, Mormonism is abreast of the most modern of the established views of science, which is to say that Whitsoe believed that his faith should coincide with the contemporary scientific consensus. And by the early 20th century, catastrophism was out of vogue. Whitsoe also accused Dalton's dreams of being unreliable. Whitsoe said, quote, we must not accept direct revelation except in matters that we can solve for ourselves. The tradition of Mormonism is, of course, founded on Joseph Smith's visionary experiences, but by the early 20th century, revelation in the church had been what some have called domesticated. That is, turned into personal emotional promptings rather than dramatic visions that claim empirical fact. In short, in the divide between Whitsoe and Dalton, we can see what we might call the modernization of Mormonism, the route by which this church embraced epistemologies consistent with the 20th century American mainstream. That did not mean, though, that Dalton's ideas or his methods vanished. Rather, they became what the scholar Michael Barkun calls stigmatized knowledge. That is, knowledge people hold to despite the marginalization of these claims by the institutions that distinguish conventionally between knowledge and error. We can see, I think, Matthew Dalton surviving in two other people, and I will discuss them now. The first is Zula Brinkerhoff. Wonderful name. Zula Brinkerhoff lived in St. George, which is a desert town in southern Utah near Arizona. In the 1950s, she grew quite interested in the Hopi traditionalist movement, which is a group of Hopi leaders who were dismayed that the tribal council of the Hopi nation was cooperating with the federal government. The traditionalists wanted to reassert charismatic authority and ritual authority as the government of the Hopi nation. Now, it is a mistake to assume, as Brinkerhoff did, that the traditionalists somehow represented genuine Hopi identity, or original Hopi identity, or real Hopi identity. There were many Hopis, even at the time, who disagreed with the traditionalists. We do not want to fall into the trap of what anthropologist Brian Haley calls the neo-Indian trap, which is to say, white people who grow enamored with indigenous culture and begin to assume that indigenous culture is somehow authentic and timeless and profound in ways, excuse me, that can be frozen in amber. In so doing, like Zula Brinkerhoff, these white people often appropriated and skewed and misread Hopi culture toward their own ends, even though some traditionalists would cooperate with these people because they saw them as useful allies, ambassadors to white America. Zula Brinkerhoff developed a Mormon version of the Neo-Indian Project. She grew friendly with some traditionalist leaders, she wrote a book, she organized events, and she developed, I think, a lot of spiritual ways of being that recalled Matthew Dalton. First, Brinkerhoff insisted that the Hopi had special and exclusive knowledge about God because they descended from biblical Israel. The villages in Hopi land remind me of old Jerusalem, she wrote. The houses are exactly the same. She credited the Hopi with insight into the imminent second coming of Jesus Christ. She wrote, quote, "They know about the great destruction that awaits the world unless our inhabitants repent." And she urged white members of her church to study Hopi prophecy to better understand Mormonism itself. Second, Brinkerhoff claimed that this knowledge was the product of Hopi spiritual practices. She said that the Hopi traditionalist faction in particular possessed special knowledge of Jesus because, quote, "they still carry on that ancient life pattern of rituals, songs, and dances." She was awed when one traditionalist leader, a man named Dan Kachangva, told her that he had visions of dead Mormon leaders after participating in certain Hopi rituals. He then told Brinkerhoff that she could have such revelations too if she followed her own spiritual disciplines. As Brinkerhoff wrote, Kachangva said, quote, "Follow the advice given in your own religious teachings and you will receive." So she did this. She began intensely practicing traditional Mormon modes of spiritual discipline. She prayed. She fasted. She studied scripture. And as she did these things, she began writing letters to her friends describing encounters with spiritual presences, which she interpreted as being God or Jesus Christ. These practices taught Brinkerhoff that things that others might deem coincidence were actually meaningful. God working in her life in certain and particular ways. For instance, she got a job at Zion National Park in southern Utah, and she wrote to a friend that, quote, "Whichever way this tide takes me, it is the Lord's will," because it would bring her new opportunities to study Native Americans. But Brinkerhoff, as she did this, began to develop a form of kind of syncretic Mormonism, that is, blending her own traditions with those of others in ways that leaders of her church found distressing. Thomas Banyakia, another Hopi traditionalist leader, told her that he, while engaging in spiritual practices, found, quote, "communication with ancient peoples who can speak to us." And this made Brinkerhoff reconsider whether or not the presences she was feeling were God or Christ or something else. By the 1960s, Brinkerhoff was interacting with people often called contactees, those who believed that UFOs were messengers from advanced civilizations on other planets. Now, the contactees she interacted with were Neo-Indians themselves. That is, they tended to be white people who believed that indigenous rituals were actually communicating with other civilizations. And they sought to do this and reenact those rituals themselves. In September 1967, Zula Brinkerhoff hosted a gathering that she called a powwow, at which Tarna Halsey, a contactee, guided a group of white people in prayer. They perceived a light in the room. They felt a presence. Halsey told them that this presence was, quote, "the space people, here to fulfill scripture prophecy of the coming millennium." And you see here, I think, this fascinating intermingling of Christian language, references to Hopi practice, and to contactee culture. By 1971, Zula Brinkerhoff was corresponding with George and Doris Van Tassel, prominent contactees who were building the Integratron in the California desert, and who wanted to ask Brinkerhoff about the Hopi. Now, the leaders of Brinkerhoff's church did not like this. One wrote to her, quote, "You are off color and out of line." And she was eventually ordered to give no more talks to church gatherings. But this form of Mormonism survived in Paul Solem, who Brinkerhoff knew. Solem can be read in many ways as a contactee, right? Someone much like the Van Tassels or George Adamski. He was not even the first such figure in Prescott, Arizona, of course. George Hunt Williamson, a disciple of Adamski, had lived in Prescott for years and was well known there. But Solem's interpretation of what was happening was distinctly Mormon. Solem told the locals in Prescott, that, quote, both Mormons and Hopis have fallen away from their original teachings, which he said were originally identical. From figures like Brinkerhoff and Matthew Dalton, Solem learned that the Hopi were ancient Israelites, in fact. And he went to the traditionalists to tell them about this. And some traditionalists, like Dan Kachangva, Brinkerhoff's friend, embraced Solem. Kachangva told the Prescott Courier, quote, flying saucers are not new to the Hopi. Solem told Kachangva that, quote, these spaceships are from the planet Venus and they are among the lost 10 tribes of Israel. And because the Hopi had Israelite ancestry, the space travelers were particularly interested in them. Solem also, though, believed that this sort of knowledge could be restored and gained through particular types of spiritual discipline. He wrote a letter to Zula Brinkerhoff in 1967 explaining that he was living at Lake Klamath in southern Oregon in poverty, intentional poverty. As he wrote, right, my job is one of sacrifice. He described for her him living in an ascetic way, fasting, praying, sitting by the lake, meditating, which, quote, allowed me to make contact with the 10 lost tribes. He would sit by the lake and hear voices. For Brinkerhoff, this kind of communication would be with God or Jesus. With Solem, it was the Venusian. When he gathered people then to show them these UFOs, he followed a common pattern. Journalists recorded that Solem would ask people to sing first LDS hymns, and second, quote, spiritual Indian songs. He would then ask for silence. He would urge people to stare into the sky. He would enter a contemplative state, which observers alternately described as prayer, hypnosis, concentration, imagination, and then he would begin chanting phrases like, they are here, and he would point up into the sky, and people would look, and they would sometimes see things. One viewer told a reporter that, quote, Solem did the sighting, which is a fascinating phrase that reminds us of Brinkerhoff's powwow. Solem also faced boundary work of his own, however. Many Hopi rejected him. One traditionalist leader, a rival of Dan Kachangva, led a protest at one of Solem's events. He complained that it was traditionally Hopi would discuss strange occurrences like this and reach common consensus about what they were, whereas Solem and Dan Kachangva were simply dictating the interpretation. Many Mormons found Solem distasteful as well. He was eventually excommunicated from the church. I think we see, though, in both his intellectual genealogy and in his history, some interesting points about the nature of boundary work. That we often speak of this process as being about ideas, right? Intellectual. This idea is scientific, this idea is not. What Solem reveals to us is that boundary work also can be disrupted by practices, which can both transcend and be limited by these kinds of rhetorical boundaries that movements create. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Hey. Very good to see you all. To see so many familiar faces. And also to meet people who I haven't met before. It's just really cool to be here. My name is Hussein Agrama. I'm a professor of anthropology at the University of Chicago. That's in Chicago. Yeah, this has been a very cool and very eclectic panel, and I'm coming at the end. I don't really know what to say except sort of like what they said. So let's go to lunch. No, I'm kidding. Well, we could do that. I have a few remarks. I'll try and get them done in time so that we can get to lunch. The title is called Becoming Strange, maybe because I'm a little strange. UFOs at the edge of knowing. Don't do that. You're good. fine. So I just want to start, a few years ago, a friend of mine, a friend and a colleague, someone who had done decades of research on UFOs, sent me an email, and they signed off the email with this really cool image. It was an image from the movie Doctor Strange. And it was, have you ever seen Doctor Strange? They got like that, there's like this Escher-like image of like these twisted geometries and tangled realities. It was really cool. So I asked him, I said, hey, that was really cool. And, why'd you send that to me? And his reply was kind of surprising, because what he expressed was a deep sense of fatigue. He was just tired, he said. That we seem to keep returning to the same frameworks, the same patterns of thinking, almost despite ourselves. And he was tired. What he wanted was a new kind of thinking, a new kind of teaching, maybe even a new kind of teacher that would just yank us out of our epistemological and ontological flatlands and into something a little bit richer and a little bit stranger. Now, a secret between you and us, me and you guys, that person is here at this conference. Although he may not be sitting in this room right now at this moment, so I can say that. So we'll keep that secret. But the thing is, his words stayed with me ever since. This was quite a few years ago. And I couldn't stop thinking about them. And so they've kind of led to what I hope is going to be a provocation that I want to offer you today. Because one of the things that I've become really worried about when it comes to the UFO is that we actually are caught in the same frameworks. And we've been asking the same questions in the same ways for way, way too long. So, we talk about various shades of skepticism as opposed to the broad spectrum of belief. We talk about reason, or we talk about belief grounded in reason as opposed to belief grounded in faith. We talk about evidential data as opposed to anecdotal evidence. We talk about the science of religion and as opposed to the religion of science. I don't know if this sounds familiar to you, but it's pretty familiar to me, right? But the thing is, this is not really specific to the UFO. It's actually part of a broader intellectual game within academia. I see the academics just kind of like, no, yes, yes, that we just kind of find ourselves playing. And we're kind of endlessly erasing and redrawing the boundaries between science and religion, reason and faith. We'll show that religion can display rationality and tolerance. We'll show how science crucially relies on faith and dogma. We'll talk about how, religion historically gave rise to science. And then we'll turn around and talk about how science continually shapes and reshapes the interpretations of religion. And we just go around, on and on and on, doing the same sort of thing, a kind of recursive performance. And I start to worry that it doesn't, maybe back in the day that gave us some insight, but I feel like there's diminishing returns. And if anything, all it does is kind of reinforce certain convictions about who we are and what our capacities for knowing are, And it's almost like, we started with these distinctions to help us think about things, and now we're finding the distinctions are actually thinking us. And we kind of remain trapped within it, almost like a web. We just get stuck within it more and more deeply. So, yeah, I feel like, sometimes we might be like, yeah, we're kind of stuck, and we need to think about this more, and we need more data, or we need a more sophisticated analysis. And I think the problem is deeper, actually much, much deeper, going to some of our most basic habits of thought. And so it's like our frameworks not only don't capture the phenomenon, they distort it. And we might have to transform the very grounds of our understanding. It's a possibility I want to throw out, get us to think about. And so sometimes people say, well, let's do an interdisciplinary thing, right? We'll be interdisciplinary. And somehow, yeah, I don't think that works. I mean, on the one hand, we know that the UFO phenomenon, it kind of, it always creates a kind of profound shift. It, completely kind of disrupts our epistemologies and ontologies. It confuses and refuses our concepts and categories. So it kind of transcends our disciplines. But then at the same time, if we have an interdisciplinary conversation, the gaps between the disciplines themselves, they're just too big. And if you don't think that's true, then just kind of ask yourself, when did a theological argument ever guide a materials analysis of UFO debris? Should I say UAP debris? Sorry, I get them confused. I'm very old-fashioned, Or you take like Foucault's analysis of power. Like, when did that ever help fuel anti-gravity research? Right? The gaps are big, right? So you've got a situation where the UFO phenomenon, it transcends our categories, and then you got a situation where our disciplines, the gaps between our disciplines are almost insurmountable, right? And then on top of that, we're stuck in this like epistemological holding pattern where we're kind of asking the same questions in the same ways over and over again, right? So the question is, like, how do we get out of that? And that's my talk. Thank you very much. No. Yeah. So no, wait. So what I think we need, we need something that not only dissolves disciplinary boundaries and divisions and so on, but something that actually dissolves. They have this deep grip on us, and we got to figure out a way to kind of dissolve that. And so what I kind of want to do, very tentatively, so that you guys don't kill me afterwards, is just kind of offer the outlines of an approach that actually has 3 interlinked components. One of them is a proposal for a distinctive methodology of perception. And I'll get into that if they give me time. And the second one is actually a new sociology, or what I'd call a social phenomenology. And the third one is actually a new and very different kind of anthropology, and they have to come together. I mean, each one of them is not maybe totally new. You've probably heard about it before, but they have to come together to forge a new path. And so that's kind of what I'm calling for. So to begin, this methodology of perception. And here, we really have to change the very basis on how we perceive and how we think about perception. Not something I think we've actually kind of looked into. And so to think about this, I want to draw on an early anthropologist by the name of Marcel Mauss, French anthropologist. And he kind of has this interesting, he might sort of unexpectedly help us. He has this small essay on the techniques of the body. And what he talked about was how people cultivate their sensoriums, their ability to perceive and sense things through these various body techniques. And he talks about how this, like, sometimes the inability to perceive unseen realms, it's not because those realms are not there, but it's actually a function of an untrained or improperly trained body. And the body, he argued, was our first and most exquisitely sensitive sensing instrument. And that was way back, and I think he's still right. And it's always trained. So our perceptions are never neutral. And what's really interesting about his insight is that it redirects our attention away from belief and its justification and toward our perception and how we cultivate it. And it invites us to consider how practitioners across traditions, scientific, mystical, religious, how they train their perception to apprehend aspects of reality. And through those practices, these new capacities of the body and the mind become available. Capacities that may not have existed before the act of disciplined perception. So instead of asking what justifies belief, we can now ask, what virtues or skills and capacities do you actually need to cultivate, to sense, for example, a person's inner pain, or the presence of an evil, or maybe to perceive an angel, or to actually detect anomalies in a stream of data, or maybe even see a UFO, right? Or I should say UAP, I'm sorry. I believe, Maus wrote this, he's like, I believe that at the bottom of all of our mystical states, there are techniques of the body which have not been studied, but which were studied fully in China and India. And he actually made a really radical statement where he said, yeah, I believe there are necessarily biological means of communicating with God, divine realms. And then what he called for was a kind of psychosocial biological study of these techniques. And that was a long time ago, but despite the importance of that article, it's well cited, people know about it, it's underappreciated, and his call has been kind of left unanswered. We really haven't done that study. And so there's a really great example, and I think it's an important example. It's this example of the mathematician Srivanasa Ramanujan. Have people heard of Srivanasa Ramanujan? Right, so everybody's heard of him, right? Well, no, maybe not everybody. Okay, cool. So I'll say a word. So he had almost no formal training, and yet, despite that, he produced these theorems that were so original, they were so striking, they had such depth, sort of an aesthetic beauty. No one had ever seen them before. And that was a century ago, and even now, we're still sort of discovering how deep his mathematics were, how far they went. They disrespected all the boundaries of mathematics that existed at the time. And the interesting thing is when they asked him for the proof, we're like, well, what's the proof? He's like, what do you mean proof? I'm like, well, how'd you get the theorem? He's like, oh, I got it in a dream. I'm like, what do you mean you got it in a dream? He's like, yeah, the goddess came and gave me the theorem, And nobody knew what to do with that, right? And he's like, yeah, the goddess Namagiri. And so what was interesting is that, so his case, the interesting thing about his case, which I think is really important, is that it suggests that there's this really powerful method out there. It's a mode of disciplined knowing. I'll say more about that in a second. It already exists because Ramanujan used it, right? And it's super rigorous, it's super precise, it produces verifiable results, but it falls outside the dominant frameworks, right? And everyone talks about Ramanujan's intuition. They're like, wow, that guy was so intuitive, that's so cool, right? But no one actually ever said, oh, wait a minute, what was his method? Like what was he doing in his notebooks? Because he had notebooks, he made mistakes. And how did what he did in his notebooks articulate with his devotional practices, right? His forms of attention and meditation and so on, to come together to produce a method that was powerful, right? That produced verifiable results, right? To this day. And that was one of the most remarkable epistemological events of the 20th century, right? But the chances to actually understand the method that was involved, probably historically lost, right? So that's what I mean about, we really haven't enacted that kind of study. Now, here's the thing. Okay, so Ramanujan probably wasn't communicating with a UFO, at least not in the conventional sense. So I'm not even going to say I probably should take that back, right? But he was connecting with another mind, another form of mind, whether it was his higher self, whatever you want to call it, right? And I think that that's a crucial parallel because to engage with the UFO is to encounter another mind that doesn't follow our habitual categories. And what Ramanujan showed us was contact with such intelligences are possible, and that they can actually produce forms of knowledge that maybe we've never seen before, but which might actually be verifiable by the methods that we do have, right? So for decades, at least it seems, we've studied the UFO from a distance, as though it were a mere machine. instead of actually a living mind, right? But that kind of knowledge, it begins in relation because the other is thinking back, right? So my claim here is that to truly understand the UFO, we got to talk with it. We got to speak with it. Because how are you going to understand another person? How am I going to understand Charles? He's not just a bunch of readouts. He's a mind. And you get to know that mind, right? So what, we have to cultivate this sort of a kind of form of shared cognition, a kind of mutual awareness in which our minds become responsive to another. And the body is our most available and responsive medium for that kind of contact. And these practices do exist. I mean, they're around. We know them, but they're outside of the academia. And they live in contemplative traditions, indigenous knowledge systems, both modern and ancient, African and African diaspora traditions, modern and ancient, ritual disciplines, a lot of these things that have been dismissed by academic authority. And so my claim for this first part is that we need to look into them. We need to learn from those, respectfully learn from those people who practice them as part of their living traditions. And we need to integrate them into our own frameworks, and we have to start using them as part of our fundamental methods, right? So that's what we got to do. It's a big change, I think. Yeah, I mean, it might sound strange, but like, when was the UFO not strange? And so if we're going to address it, we have to become methodologically strange ourselves, right? And this is not a rejection of rigor, but it's an expansion of it. I mean, the encounter with the UFO reveals the incompleteness of our current ways of knowing. And if we can acknowledge that incompleteness, we can begin to develop these new techniques rooted in the body, guided by careful attention and tested through experience to meet another mind on its own terms where it lives. But method, cool as it is, actually method is usually not very cool, but method alone is not enough, actually. So if the UFO presents us with another kind of mind, then we have to ask ourselves, how that mind acts and communicates. And so what we need, this is the second component. And it's going to sound strange, I know. I think what we need is a sociology of non-human intelligence, right? But not one grounded in speculation, because like, the three-body problem, Cixin Liu, he says we have to come up with a cosmic sociology and starts with a bunch of axioms which like have no foundation whatsoever. No. But we have to look at how they appear, how they interact, and how they take form in human experience. And so that means that we have to begin with those who have experienced contact firsthand. In other words, we have to begin with the experiencers. And they possess a wealth of understanding that we've only begun to appreciate, right? And so if you look at their reports, I mean, you can find throughout the decades all over the world, there are a set of consistencies or patterns that are so consistent that we just can't ignore them. And I'll just name three, right? So first, not always, but it's very consistent, communication typically bypasses language. It's mind to mind, in these dense packets of like tone and texture and concept, like all at once, right? We sometimes say telepathic. I think it's deeper than that, but fine. Second, time, they inhabit time differently. Time becomes elastic, past, present, and potential futures, they converge and collapse upon each other into like a single perceptual field. That's the second thing. And the third is they seem to exhibit what Colin Kelleher, the scientist, am I out of time? A couple more minutes? Yeah. What the Colin Kelleher, the scientist, who studied this extensively, something he calls bidirectional mimicry, which is, it basically reflects back our cultural forms, technological, humanoid, religious, but scrambled somehow, and usually temporally scrambled, right? So it's kind of reflecting back the forms that exist within our own sort of cultural storehouses, right? But kind of in a scrambled form, and through that process, it begins to enter that particular storehouse as well, right? So these three sort of elements, which goes to show that if we're going to do a sociology of the NHI, it has to turn into a social phenomenology of contact, right, in order to begin to understand that. And when we begin to look at some of these patterns, one of the things that becomes totally evident, right, so that's the second thing, right, sociology of NHI, which becomes a social phenomenology of contact. But then when we look at these patterns, we begin to realize something, which is that the UFO interacts with us at the level of our collective imagination, right? It refracts through those forms, and then back to ourselves in ways that are unfamiliar. And so what we actually need then is to understand how our collective imagination works, how it's socially organized, right? So what we actually need, and this is the third component, is an anthropology of the collective imagination, right? But we need to think about the collective imagination, not just as something which is just purely produced by the human mind, that's purely a human invention, but we need to think about the collective imagination as a contact zone, right? A space of interaction between human and non-human intelligence, right? And so what we need to do, besides just understanding how the UFO becomes entangled in those forms, we need to trace how those forms, imaginal forms, how they arise, how they shift, how they return, how they move through time, formed and reformed at this threshold where human perception and non-human agency actually meet. And so the collective imagination is not an explanation, but it's a medium through which various agencies become visible and thinkable and real, right? So I've said three things: methodology of perception, a sociology of the NHI, which becomes a social phenomenology of contact, and three, an anthropology of the collective imagination as a contact zone. These are the three things that have to fit together. You can't do the one without doing the other. And so in ending, I know I gotta end, right? So you guys are gonna kill me. I just wanna say one thing. There's actually kind of a fourth thing, right? You knew that was coming, right? This is gonna be really short, I promise, right? Because we gotta eat lunch. One of the things we need to do, and this kind of connects with the ethical sort of dimension of this, we need to actually look at what's in our collective imagination now, right? And because it's not neutral. And I've been studying the collective imagination for a while, I admit. I'm sorry, I have been. So, and what I've seen since the 50s, at least, is that it's become increasingly shaped, if not deeply warped, by this sort of incessant secrecy, relentless suspicion, hyper-militarized epistemologies, and institutional incentives that prioritize control and competition over understanding and truth. And if the UFO operates through our collective imagination, then what that imagination is, its structure and its commitments, that conditions how the phenomenon appears. If we obscure, it's going to obscure, right? If we approach with mistrust, it's going to manifest mistrust. If we fracture our knowledge, it's going to appear, or it will manifest in a fragmented way, because it's fundamentally responsive. So beyond methods of perception, beyond a phenomenology of contact, beyond an anthropology of the imaginal, what we might need actually is a movement, an epistemic movement that insists on openness, honesty, shared inquiry. Just like the open source movement transformed software by changing social commitments of coders, we might need a transformation to organize our collective imagination so that it's committed toward truth and transparency. Because otherwise, the UFO will continually elude us. So that's it, folks.